I think we have to take credit to Congress to work on how we can build a peace movement. So we have a handful of speakers. They would have been protesters. In fact, our first protest speaker, Joe Lombardo from UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, has been a long-time social justice and anti-war activist. He's commented a lot on independent media and on TV, and he was planning on bringing tens of thousands of people with him today to the protest. But instead he'll be our lead speaker. And UNAC is a really important organization, does a lot of great work. And so please welcome Joe to give us a kind of a sense of where the peace movement is.
Get behind the speaker! Get behind the speaker!
Yeah, if you're
Does this work? Okay. So I've been around doing anti-war work for a long time. I started during the Vietnam War period when I was in college, and then I was a staff person for the National Peace Action Coalition, which was one of the two major coalitions that organized against the Vietnam War. And what I want to do in the 8 minutes that I have is try to talk a little bit about some of the differences between the Vietnam War period and the period that we're for us to organize a movement that can be effective. Now, the Vietnam War was in the very beginning called one of the only consensus wars in US history. In the very beginning of the Vietnam War, only 8% opposed it. And during the 9 years of that war, that 8% grew to about 88% of the population in the United States. And that mass sentiment was so large, it got down to every corner of the population. It was reflected in the culture, it was reflected in the mass demonstrations, it was reflected in the music, and it affected, and so forth, no longer a viable fighting force. If you see movies of that period, you'll see that there were peace signs, and the Black liberation movement was happening at the same time, the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, and all these movements really had mass sentiment, and they were reflected within the military, and the military wouldn't obey their orders. They'd say, go take that hill, the officer would say, and they'd say, you go take that hill. And there were instances of fragging. In fact, there were over 300 instances of fragging that happened in the last year of the so deep that when they finally lost the war, when the United States brought people home, and you remember the scenes of people hanging onto helicopters and top of buildings and trying to get away, that they developed a phrase for what happened to the American population, and it was called the Vietnam Syndrome. They did not want to see another war like Vietnam again. And it really took a whole generation and 9/11 before they were able to do these wars again. And they went into Afghanistan after that, and then went into Iraq. And you might remember, right before they went into Iraq on February 15th, the largest demonstrations took place anywhere around the world. There were about 500,000 people in New York City. There were about 300,000 in San Francisco. There were 1 million in Rome. There were 1 million in Tokyo. There were millions all over the world. In fact, it's the only internationally coordinated demonstrations that happened on every continent of the world simultaneously. The people came out from those research stations to oppose the war. And the New York Times said now there are still two superpowers. Before there was the Soviet Union and the United States and the people of the world. And we have to make that a reality, which we have not really done yet. Right after these demonstrations, Bush got on TV and they said, what do you think of all these demonstrations? Is it going to affect your policy? And he said, well, I think that was a good focus group that we saw out in the streets. But it made something clear to me that simple mass sentiment was not going to stop the war anymore. It had to be stronger. There had to be something else that was that was going to happen. And I think they were able to leave Vietnam, but were not able to leave Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Yemen or any of these. But maybe in a discussion we can talk about why I say that. Because Trump obviously doesn't say that. He says, look, the economy's going better than ever before. That's bull. And so they have a difficult time because so much of our economy is based upon the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, overseas to all of these people, all of these countries. Imagine if they just demobilized the military and brought them home. There'd be jobs. Imagine if they just let the 2.2 million people who shouldn't be in jail out of jobs. Our system could not support that kind of thing. And so war is an integral part today of everything we do on imperialism. And we have to learn how to fight against that. But more than every area of our society is under attack. The black community, immigrants, unions, workers. This is all part of what we call the war at home. And for many people, the particular attack they're under is the immediate threat, and war seems as a secondary threat. We have to learn to make that concrete for people, that all of their struggles have an international component, and all of the international struggles have a domestic component, and that's the war at home and war abroad that now the movement talks about in general ways. They learned things from Vietnam. They learned they didn't want to have a draft. They learned that the news media should not cover what happens. If you remember during Vietnam, they always had the number of people died, the heroes that was scrolling on the TV. That turned out to be a negative for them. People say, why are we getting all these people killed? 60,000 people died in Vietnam, Americans, and 4 million Vietnamese. We carpet bombed in North Vietnam. We destroyed the dikes and so forth. So I think there's a program that we need to look at in terms of building the movement today. First of all, we have to be very clear. It's the United States of America. It's not Russia and China and the United States. It's the United States of America. We have troops in 172 countries. We have 20 times the number of military bases as all other countries in the world combined. Just the increase in our military budget is more than the military budget of all of Russia. We have to understand we have an international campaign. And we have a common cause with all the people who are being attacked by imperialism. If you could make it to Ireland next week, we're going to have a major conference on military bases. People from 35 countries and about 60 of us from the United States are going. Unity is expected in our movement. When we are small, we have to come together. We have to put together away some of the differences. To a coalition, UNAC, because I'm trying to bring these groups together. We have to be action and oriented about Kavanaugh and the Supreme Court, but you know, it was a Republican Supreme Court when Roe versus Wade was passed, but we were in the masses in the streets. And finally, we have to understand the wars at home and the wars abroad, and that racism has been part of every anti-war movement, and we have to fight together with all the people in struggle, and that's how we can build a strong movement.
Okay, is that on? Yes, okay. Thank you, Joe. So we're going to stay with that international issue right now because imperialism is really the foundation of U.S. foreign policy and has been for a long time. Our next speaker, Bernard Ellerman, works on this issue from the perspective of the national spokesperson of the U.S. chapter of Bayan USA. This is an alliance of 23 Filipino organizations across the United States, workers, immigrants, youth, students, women, culture workers, artists, and LGBT people. It's the main political center for anti-imperialist mass movement in the Philippines, Bayan. Order the struggle for national democracy with a socialist perspective. Ellerman is also a member of the International Coordinating Committee of the International League of People's Struggle, a global anti-imperialist and democratic formation present in over 40 countries, He represents the national and social liberation movements against imperialism and reaction. Please welcome Bernadette.
Good morning. I'm just gonna sit down. I'm just gonna sit down. So in the Philippines, when we say anti-imperialism, what we really mean in our context is national liberation. Because the Philippines was a direct colony and is now a neo-colony of the US. So we are trying to liberate ourselves from the clutches of US imperialism that has seeped into every fabric of our society. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an incident that happened earlier this year in San Francisco. A Bayan comrade from Mindanao by the name of Jerome Abba was traveling to the US upon the invitation of churches here in DC who are convening for the Ecumenical Advocacy Days. You might be familiar because it takes place in DC every year. And they come together to talk about social issues, global issues, and then they advocate in Capitol Hill afterwards. So Jerome was a resource speaker on the Philippines. His port of entry was SFO, San Francisco International Airport, back in April. And on April 17, when he landed, we were waiting outside of the airport to receive him. He never left the airport. We found out through a glitch call of customs that he was being held up in the airport by customs. We immediately mobilized and organized a rally at the airport to demand his immediate release. We also went to the Philippine consulate to seek assistance from them. We rallied for over 24 hours, and then we were told that he was forcibly removed and sent back to the Philippines. Jerome received a visa. He went through the whole process of going through what needed to